It's genuinely a bit of a head-scratcher when you think about it. Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd president, his grandfather was William Henry Harrison, the ninth.
Yeah, I mean, grandfather and grandson both reaching the highest office. That's incredibly rare in U.S. history.
It really is not something you see every day. It makes you think about family legacies and, well, how history plays out.
Definitely. And how individuals get sort of swept up in these bigger national stories, sometimes generations apart.
Exactly. And that's really the thread we want to pull on today. We've got these sources you shared on Benjamin Harrison, and our goal is to dig into his whole journey.
Right. Beyond just the basic facts.
Yeah, from that, famous family background and his Civil War time right through to his presidency and what it all actually meant. What was the impact?
We want to unpack the key policies, definitely, the big challenges he faced, and maybe some of the less talked about details that give us a clearer picture of the man and his times.
Okay, let's dive in. So Benjamin Harrison, born in North Bend, Ohio, 1833. But that family name, it goes way back, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The Harrisons of Virginia were, well, pretty prominent figures in early America. You mentioned his grandfather, the president, obviously.
Right.
But his great-grandfather, also Benjamin Harrison V, he signed the Declaration of Independence, a direct link to the founding generation.
Wow, that's some serious historical weight. But I gather his immediate family, his parents, they weren't exactly rolling in wealth despite the name.
No, not at all. The name carried prestige, sure, but financially. They weren't wealthy. His father, John Scott Harrison, who actually served in Congress himself, he really prioritized education for his kids, all 10 of them.
10 kids.
Yeah.
So education was the focus. What did that look like for young Benjamin?
Well, initially, pretty typical for the era and the place, a one-room log cabin schoolhouse near home. But later, see his potential. They got him a tutor to prep him for college. And then, 1847, he's 14, he enrolls at Farmers College near Cincinnati. And that's where something significant happened.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
That's where he met Caroline Scott, his future wife.
Ah.
Her father, John Witherspoon Scott, was a professor there, science, and also a Presbyterian minister. So you see these threads, education and faith, weaving into his life pretty early on.
Interesting. Those early connections often do shape things. And his education continued after Farmers College.
Yes, he transferred to Miami University in Ohio, graduated in 1852. He joined Phi Delta Theta there, the fraternity, which, provided a network later.
Yeah.
Also Delta Chi, the law fraternity.
So law was already on his mind.
Seems like it. And he was apparently quite influenced by a professor of history and political economy, Robert Hamilton Bishop. Also, it was at Miami that he formally joined the Presbyterian Church, which became a lifelong commitment.
Okay, so family history, focus on education, religious faith, starting to get a picture. Let's talk marriage and early career. He married Caroline Scott pretty quickly after graduating 1853.
That's right. Her father, the minister, performed the ceremony. They had 2 children, Russell and Mary. For the first year or so, they actually lived on his father's farm while Benjamin finished his law studies. He passed the Ohio bar in early '54.
And then they headed west.
They did. Used a small inheritance, moved to Indianapolis, Indiana later that year. And Indianapolis really became his base, for law, for politics, everything.
What did he do initially there?
Started practicing law. He also served as a crier for the federal court, which sounds a bit archaic now, but it was a job. And he was a commissioner for the U.S. Court of Claims. Gave him some steady income early on.
Sounds like he integrated into the Indianapolis scene pretty quickly.
Very much so. He was a founder and the first president of the University Club there, and the Phi Delta Theta Alumni Club, too. He and Caroline were very active in the First Presbyterian Church, became elders, deacons, real leaders in the congregation.
And politically, his family were Whigs traditionally, but that party was fading.
Exactly. He joined the new Republican Party pretty early, around 1856, campaigned for their first presidential candidate, John C. Fremont. Then, in 1857, he got his first taste of elected office, Indianapolis City Attorney.
Okay, starting his climb.
And his law practice grew, too. Had a couple of partnerships, Wallace and Harrison, then Fishback and Harrison, built a solid reputation. And just before the war broke out, in 1860, he was elected reporter of the Indiana Supreme Court, a pretty prestigious state position.
So, respected lawyer, rising political figure in Indiana, and then the nation splits apart, the Civil War. He enlisted in '62. Must have been a tough call with a young family.
It absolutely was. He was definitely concerned about supporting them. But the story goes, he met with Indiana's governor, Oliver Morton, who was really worried about the lack of troops.
Yeah.
Harrison apparently said, "If I can be of any service, I will go."
And he didn't just enlist, he raised a regiment.
He did. Morton asked him to recruit, and Harrison went around northern Indiana signing men up. He was hesitant about leading, apparently, because he had zero military experience. But eventually, they commissioned him as a colonel, leading the 70th Indiana Infantry in August '62.
And did the 70th Indiana see much fighting?
Well, for the first couple of years, it was mostly reconnaissance, guarding railroads in Kentucky and Tennessee. Important work, but maybe not frontline combat.
Right.
But then, May 1864, things changed. He and his regiment joined General Sherman's big Atlanta campaign, part of the Army of the Cumberland. And he moved up fast, soon commanding a whole brigade, the 1st Brigade, 1st Division, XX Corps.
And that Atlanta campaign was intense. He was in the thick of it.
Oh, yeah. He led his brigade at Resaca, Peachtree Creek, the siege of Atlanta itself. At Resaca, they made this really successful charge against Confederate artillery. And at Peachtree Creek, his men held the line against a fierce attack. Apparently, they ran so low on ammo, they had to pick up cartridges from fallen Confederates.
Wow. Intense stuff. Sounds like he handled himself well under fire. Did Sherman notice?
He certainly did. After Atlanta fell, Sherman specifically praised Harrison for his foresight, discipline, and a fighting spirit. High praise from Sherman. Later, his brigade fought at the Battle of Nashville, too, another key Union victory.
It's interesting, though, despite proving himself a capable commander, he didn't seem to embrace the glory of war, did he?
No, that's a really good point. He seemed to view it more as a grim necessity. There's a quote from him later, in 1888, "We Americans have no commission from God to police the world." Gives you a sense of his perspective.
He did get recognized for his service, though, a promotion.
Yes. Early '65, Lincoln nominated him for the rank of Brevet Brigadier General, sort of an honorary promotion, recognizing specific actions. The Senate confirmed it, citing his leadership at Resaca and Peachtree Creek. He served right through to the end, marched in the Grand Review in D.C., and then mustered out in June 1865.
So back to civilian life as a decorated war hero, did he just jump back into law?
Pretty much immediately. Actually, kind of amazing. While he was still in the Army in late '64, he was reelected as reporter of the Indiana Supreme Court. So he had that position waiting for him.
Kept his options open.
Right. Held that job for another 4 years. It gave him some stability while he rebuilt his law practice in Indianapolis. And he quickly became known again as, a top lawyer and a really compelling speaker.
Did he handle any big cases after the war?
Yeah, one notable one. In 1869, President Grant appointed him to represent the government in a civil suit, Milligan v. Hovey. It stemmed from that famous Supreme Court case, Ex parte Milligan.
About military trials during wartime.
Exactly. The whole question of trying civilians in military courts when civilian courts are open. Milligan won his civil suit, but Harrison, representing the government, managed to limit the damages awarded based on existing laws.
And his political career picked back up, too.
Definitely. He ran for governor of Indiana in 1876, but lost. Still, his profile kept rising in the Republican Party. He helped mediate the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 in Indianapolis, which showed some leadership skill outside of politics, served on the Mississippi River Commission, too.
Getting involved in national issues.
And he became a real player within the party. He was apparently instrumental at the 1880 Republican Convention, helping James A. Garfield secure the presidential nomination.
That must have boosted his own standing considerably.
No doubt. And the payoff came soon after. In 1881, the Indiana legislature elected him to the U.S. Senate.
Okay, so Senator Harrison, what were his priorities there?
Well, reflecting his background, he was a big advocate for pensions for Civil War veterans. He also pushed for federal aid for education, especially in the South, trying to bridge some post-war divides, though that didn't pass.
Interesting.
And maybe surprisingly for the time and party, he actually opposed the Chinese Exclusion Act on principle.
Pukistan there served one term.
Yes, until 1887. And then, just a year later, 1888, he's the Republican nominee for president.
Against the incumbent, Grover Cleveland. And that election was weird, wasn't it? Popular vote versus Electoral College?
Exactly. Cleveland got about 90,000 more popular votes, but Harrison won the Electoral College pretty comfortably, 233 to 168. A reversal of fortune for Cleveland, who had won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College 4 years earlier against Blaine, though he still won the presidency that year. Wait, no, Cleveland won both in '84, my mistake. But in '88, Harrison won the Electoral College despite losing the popular vote.
Right, got it. And Harrison's campaign, what was the focus?
Protective tariffs, that was a big one. Arguing they were essential for American industry. He also famously used the front porch, campaign style, stayed home in Indianapolis,
Right.
and gave speeches to delegations that came to visit him.
Effective, apparently. Though there were some controversies. Vote buying allegations.
Yeah, the blocks of five-letter scandal emerged after the election, suggesting potential bribery or vote buying by Republicans in Indiana. It cast a bit of a shadow.
So he enters the White House with a somewhat contested victory and a focus on tariffs. Let's get into his presidency. Domestic policy first. What did his inauguration signal?
It was a fairly brief speech, actually. He hit on themes like education, religion, and encouraging industry in the South, trying to heal those sectional divides, and, of course, protective tariffs, statehood for territories, and pensions for veterans. Those were key planks.
How did he put together his cabinet? Did he reward the party faithful?
He was actually pretty independent about it, sometimes ruffled the feathers of party bosses. Like, he made James C. Blaine wait a bit for the Secretary of State confirmation just to show he was in charge.
Asserting himself.
Right. Some appointees shared his background, Civil War vets, Indiana connections, fellow Presbyterians. But his independent streak did annoy some powerful Republicans.
Okay. Civil service reform was a hot topic then. Did he push hard on that?
He'd campaigned supporting the merit system, getting away from pure patronage. But progress was limited. He spent a lot of his early time dealing with appointments, people wanting jobs, and the issue itself divided Congress. He appointed reformers to the Civil Service Commission, but didn't really champion major new legislation.
Pensions, though. That was something he did act on, right?
Oh, absolutely. The Dependent and Disability Pension Act of 1890 was huge. It dramatically increased the number of veterans and dependents eligible for pensions, and federal spending on pensions shot up to record levels.
Good for veterans, maybe not so good for the budget.
Exactly. It fulfilled a promise, but it also helped drain the Treasury surplus that had built up. And there were issues with the Pension Bureau trying to manage the massive increase, some claims of mismanagement.
Let's talk economics. The McKinley tariff. That's almost synonymous with his term.
It really is. Championed by William McKinley in the House and Nelson Aldrich in the Senate, it pushed import duties way up, some of the highest rates ever. The idea was pure protectionism for American industries.
But wasn't there a flip side? Reciprocity.
Yes. Urged by Secretary Blaine, Harrison insisted on including reciprocity provisions. So the president could lower tariffs on goods from countries that lowered their tariffs on American products, trying to open markets too.
So a carrot and stick approach. But it was still controversial.
Very. It led to higher consumer prices on some goods, and it definitely fueled the perception of a billion-dollar Congress. A Congress that spent lavishly, partly because the tariff generated so much revenue, at least initially.
And alongside tariffs, there was the Sherman Antitrust Act, another landmark.
A huge one.
Yeah.
Passed with wide bipartisan support, amazingly. First federal law aimed at monopolies and trusts. Harrison signed it, supported its goals publicly.
But did it have teeth in the...
Not so much. The Harrison administration didn't pursue enforcement very aggressively. They filed a few cases, but it took years and later presidents for the Sherman Act to really start having a major impact.
Okay, then there's the whole money issue. Gold versus silver. That was tearing the country apart, wasn't it?
Deeply divisive. Farmers and debtors generally wanted more silver in circulation, free silver, to inflate the currency and make debts easier to pay. Creditors and the financial establishment favored the gold standard.
Where did Harrison stand?
It's a bit unclear. He seemed to lean towards bimetallism using both gold and silver. His Treasury Secretary, Wyndham, was more of a silver supporter. Harrison tried to find a middle path, maybe free coinage of silver based on its market value, not a fixed ratio to gold. But nobody was happy.
So what happened?
They compromised with the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890. The government had to buy a certain amount of silver each month and issue Treasury notes backed by it. But it kind of backfired. It made people nervous about the gold standard, and they started redeeming those Treasury notes for gold, draining the nation's gold reserves. A major headache.
Wow. Unintended consequences. Let's shift to civil rights. You mentioned Harrison advocated for African American rights.
This is really important and often overlooked. He was quite outspoken for his time, urging federal action to protect black voting rights in the South, where they were being systematically denied. His attorney general even brought some prosecutions.
Did he propose specific legislation?
Yes, he strongly backed the Lodge Bill, sometimes called the Force Bill. It would have allowed federal supervision of federal elections to ensure black men could vote.
But it failed.
It passed the House, but got blocked by Democrats and some silver-supporting Republicans in the Senate. A huge disappointment for Harrison and civil rights advocates. It was really the last major attempt at federal protection for black voting rights until, well, decades later, maybe the 1930s or even the 50s and 60s.
A significant moment, even in failure. Despite that, he kept speaking out.
He did. Advocated for federal school funding regardless of race, even suggested a constitutional amendment to overturn parts of the civil rights cases ruling that had weakened earlier protections.
Okay. What about conservation? National forests?
Yes. The Land Revision Act of 1891 had this key clause allowing the president to set aside public lands as forest reserves, and Harrison used it. He created the very first reserves. Yellowstone Timberland Reserve was the first, followed by others. Ended up setting aside about 22 million acres.
That's impressive, a real legacy there.
Definitely. He also protected the Casa Grande ruin in Arizona, an important ancestral Puebloan site, an early nod to preserving cultural heritage, too.
And any movement on labor issues during his term?
Some notable steps, yes. Restrictions on using convict labor on federal projects, the first federal safety regulations for coal mines, an investigation into slum conditions in cities, an 8-hour workday for federal public works employees, and the Railway Safety Appliance Act, near the end of his term, aimed to make railroad work safer.
So, addressing some of the challenges of industrialization, what about Native American policy? It was a difficult era.
Very difficult. His administration largely followed the assimilationist path, pushing the Dawes Act, breaking up tribal lands into individual plots. The goal, they argued, was to turn Native Americans into farmers and integrate them.
But the results were often devastating for tribes.
Absolutely. Loss of land, erosion of culture and sovereignty. Harrison also dealt with the rise of the ghost dance movement, which culminated tragically in the Wounded Knee Massacre in late 1890. He ordered an investigation and sent troops, but the underlying policy of forced assimilation continued.
A complex and often somber picture there. Let's switch to foreign policy. Was his administration active internationally?
Yes, definitely more assertive than some predecessors. They focused heavily on Latin America, pushing for commercial reciprocity treaties, basically, mutual tariff reductions. Signed 8 of them, tried to build closer economic ties.
In Samoa, wasn't there some tension there?
There had been, but during his term, the U.S., Germany, and Britain agreed on a 3-way protectorate over Samoa, sort of stabilizing the situation, at least temporarily.
What about Europe? Any friction points?
The big one was pork. Several European countries had banned American pork imports, citing health concerns, though protectionism was likely a factor.
Pork diplomacy.
You could call it that. Harrison's administration threatened to retaliate with tariffs on European goods, especially sugar. And it worked. Most of the bans were lifted. Showed a willingness to use economic muscle.
Any major diplomatic crises?
2 stand out. One was with Chile, the Baltimore crisis. U.S. sailors on shore leave in Valparaiso were attacked by a mob. 2 were killed. Harrison took a very firm line, demanded an apology and reparations. Tensions got high, almost led to war, but Chile eventually backed down.
Okay. And the other?
A dispute with Great Britain over seal hunting rights in the Bering Sea, off Alaska. American vessels were seizing Canadian sealing ships. It was complicated, involving international waters. Negotiations started under Harrison and eventually led to arbitration after he left office.
And finally, Hawaii. That situation heated up towards the end of his term, right?
It did. American planters and residents, with some quiet support from the U.S. minister there, overthrew Queen Liliuokalani. Harrison's administration quickly recognized the new provisional government and negotiated a treaty to annex Hawaii.
But it didn't happen on his watch.
No. He submitted the treaty to the Senate, but they didn't act on it before his term ended in March 1893. Grover Cleveland came back into office and withdrew the treaty, opposing annexation at that time.
So, a very active 4 years, domestically and internationally. Any other interesting tidbits from his presidency?
A few. He appointed 4 Supreme Court justices. A record 6 states joined the Union: North and South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming. Big expansion.
Wow, 6?
He was the first president to have electricity in the White House. Though apparently, he and Caroline were a bit scared of the switches and often had staff turn the lights on and off.
Understandable back then, I guess.
His administration also continued the buildup of the modern Navy, commissioning several new battleships and cruisers. And a cool piece of trivia. His is the earliest known recording of a U.S. president's voice, captured on a wax cylinder phonograph in 1889.
That's amazing. A voice from the past. But despite all this activity, he only served 1 term. What happened in the 1892 election?
It was another rematch against Grover Cleveland. But this time, the tide turned against Harrison. The McKinley Tariff wasn't popular with everyone, especially farmers and consumers feeling the pinch of higher prices. The billion-dollar Congress image hurt too, suggested government overspending.
And the Populist Party.
Yes, The rise of the Populist Party drew votes away from the Republicans, particularly in the West. And on a personal level, his wife Caroline was seriously ill with tuberculosis and died just 2 weeks before the election. A devastating blow.
That's incredibly sad. So Cleveland won.
Yes, Cleveland won both the popular vote and the Electoral College decisively. Harrison became a one-term president.
What did he do after leaving office in 93?
Returned to Indianapolis, went back to his law practice, stayed involved in public life, though. Served on the Board of Trustees for Purdue University. He wrote a book about American government called This Country of Ours.
Did he remarry?
Yes, in 1896, he married Mary Scott Lord Dimmock. She was actually Caroline's niece, and had helped care for her during her illness. It caused a bit of a stir, even estranged him from his adult children for a time.
Anything else notable in his later years?
He took on a major international legal case representing Venezuela in its long-standing border dispute with Great Britain over the boundary with British Guiana. Argued the case before an international tribunal in Paris. Raised his profile again as a respected legal mind.
And he remained active in the church.
Very much so. Remained a prominent figure in the Presbyterian Church right up until his death. He died in Indianapolis in 1901 from complications related to influenza. Pneumonia, basically.
So looking back, how do historians generally see Benjamin Harrison? What's his reputation?
He often gets ranked as sort of average,
Yeah.
middle of the pack. But most historians acknowledge his high personal integrity, his intelligence, and his commitment to certain principles.
Like what specifically?
Well, he's credited with signing some truly significant legislation. The Sherman Antitrust Act, the McKinley Tariff, for better or worse, the Silver Purchase Act, the Land Revision Act creating forest reserves. And his foreign policy was definitely more active, more assertive than many before him.
And the civil rights efforts.
That's seen as important, even though it failed legislatively. It marks him as one of the last presidents for a long time to make a serious federal push for black voting rights. A significant, if ultimately tragic, part of his legacy.
How is he remembered today? Memorials.
His Indianapolis home is a museum, the Benjamin Harrison Presidential Site. There have been postage stamps, coins. Fort Benjamin Harrison near Indianapolis was named for him. There are buildings named Harrison Hall at Miami University and Purdue. So he's remembered, maybe just not as vividly as some other presidents.
Okay, so summing it up, Harrison's presidency, it was really packed with legislation, wasn't it? Especially on the economy, tariffs, trusts, currency, and shaping the growing nation with those new states.
Absolutely. And while his civil rights push failed, it really highlighted his vision on that front. Plus, that more assertive foreign policy definitely signaled America's changing role in the world.
You know, thinking about all that economic legislation, the tariff, the Silver Act, and then what happened right after he left office. The Panic of 1893, a major depression.
Right. It really makes you think, doesn't it, about cause and effect. How much did those policies contribute? What were the intended versus the unintended consequences? It's a complex legacy.
It really is a fascinating point to ponder. We've really just scratched the surface here today on Benjamin Harrison. There's so much more to explore about his life, his presidency, the era he governed in.
Definitely. We encourage everyone listening to dig into the sources, read more, and form your own views on this complex and maybe slightly underrated president.
Absolutely. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.